I'd like to introduce my friend, Todd Guenther. He lives in Fremont County, Wyoming, which is like different from Natrona County where I live. I've known Todd for some time, and I've admired both his scholarship over many years as well as his personality. He's a great guy. So I hope, but I can tell you a little bit about him here, and just so I don't forget anything, I'm going to tell you what it says here. He had ancestors who served in the Frontier Army during the early 1860s and homesteaded on the Dakota prairies in 1873. His first brush with archaeology was at the Bordeaux Trading Post near Fort Laramie. He holds 2 degrees from the University of Wyoming, and he worked for many years for the State Archaeology Office, and he was the curator at South Pass City, which means he spent winters
I got a picture. I have photos.
at South Pass City, which if you've ever been there, I wouldn't want to do that. So, and even after that, he was director of the Land of Pioneer Museum. He's now on the faculty as both an archaeologist and a historian at Central Wyoming College in Riverton, Wyoming. And he is busy every summer. I can never get hold of Todd in the summer because he's out in the field digging old stuff up. So here's a young man I'd like to introduce. His name's Todd Guenther. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Tom. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. I don't know what a little closer, so I need to hold this thing. But I wave my arms around a lot when I talk, and I pace back and forth, so this will be a challenge. I'd like to thank Tom for inviting me and the Wyoming chapter for inviting me to be here. Oregon Trails are, and I say plural, is the love of my life academically. And I've been dragged away from this topic for about 10 or 15 years now by some other projects, but it's good to be back here and rubbing elbows with all of you again. What I want to talk about, or what Tom asked me to talk about, is South Pass and the meaning of the place. And so I'm going to have a little bit different, it has to do with winter. I'm going to have a little bit different perspective on all of this maybe than what you're used to. But I also have to tell you that I just got back from 2 months in the field, and I've been working up between 12 and 14,000 or 13,500 feet with an archaeological field school for 2 months. And when I was a kid, my mother often made us boys take our clothes off before we could come in the house, and she would hose us down. And that's about the reception that I got when I got home after 2 months with all of these students who are now in graduate programs scattered across the country. We walked about 150 miles with full packs, moving camps day after day, and there's a lot of archaeology in the high country. You've been hearing about the glaciers melting and everything else, and it's true. There's a lot of prehistoric activity up there. And so, to get back to the topic, because I tend to ramble a lot, I have slides here to guide me. We're going to leave the Platte. That's the theme of this conference. This is one of Jackson's old paintings of Red Butte Station. The trail leaves the Platte and heads on over to the Sweetwater, which is my home territory. And the little star there under Lander is South Pass. And as far as I'm concerned, it's the center of the universe. Some people argue with me, but I talk them to death. And the Continental Divide, which was the western border of the Louisiana Purchase, ran right down the crest of the Wind Rivers, right through South Pass, over Oregon Buttes and everything else. Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark out west to find a practical trade route, travel route with the Pacific, so that that ancient dream of Marco Polo could be realized, trading with the Orient, trading with the Asian nations. And they failed. The route that they followed did not pan out in terms of being something that the traders or travelers could use. And it wasn't until 1836 that 2 young women, missionaries, on their way to Oregon and Washington, Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Spalding, made that journey and summited the Continental Divide on July 4th, Independence Day. And then Eliza Spalding wrote in her journal, "We crossed a ridge of land today, which separates the waters that flow into the Atlantic from those that flow into the Pacific." Hardly even attracted her attention. She didn't realize what a historic event she had just accomplished, because it didn't matter yet, but it would. Because when news of their accomplishment got back east, there were tens of thousands of fathers and husbands all across the eastern U.S. who said, well, if those women could do it, then my wife and my daughters and my kids can make that trip, and we can go out to Oregon and get all the free land out there. And so South Pass became the key to the continent, the gateway to the continent, and the gateway to the future, to the American future. And because we became so big and wealthy and powerful, really the future of the planet as well. And so when we're looking at this map, South Pass is right there at the little corner where basically Mexico and Oregon country, or Canada, and the United States all come together. That's the choke point. And this was an important place because it was the only route that was that facilitated the traffic, the tens of thousands of people each year to get out to the West Coast and claim the West Coast from other nations. And so this is an 1863 map that shows, or detail of a map that shows that South Pass area. And it really looks like a choke point here, like we have tall mountains to the north and tall mountains to the south. But the reality is a little bit different. A lot of people are kind of disappointed when they see South Pass, and it's just another big, flat, boring desert covered with sagebrush and prickly pear. But the meaning of the place, again, is what's important, not the way it looks. And that monument on the left there, that little stone one, has been criticized as being sexist and racist and everything else. Narcissa Prentice Whitman, Eliza Hart Spalding, first white women to cross this pass, July 4th, 1836. And the old pioneer, Civil War vet from Ohio, who came out to South Pass in 1868 and spent the rest of his life in South Pass and Lander, shipped that out by hand with a hammer and a chisel because he understood the historical significance. He also had lived with the Arapahoes. He knew that Native women, especially Shoshones, the South Pass area is the center of their traditional homelands, but from many other tribes had gone back and forth across South Pass for thousands and thousands of years. But when Whitman and Spalding made the trip, that changed world history. And that the tradition of putting up stone monuments that everybody knows, everybody in this room knows, began with Ezra Meeker putting up his monuments as he traveled back to Washington. This is the South Pass boulder that he put up. And then on the right photo there is Meeker in 1916 when he came back through Lander and South Pass with a V12 or a V16 Pathfinder automobile rigged out to look like a covered wagon. And beside him is this fellow from Lander, Captain Nickerson, who decided that he thought this was a great idea and put up monuments all over the South Pass area and even became a member of the State Monuments Commission and put up monuments all around the state of Wyoming. Here he is on the right photo in his backyard carving another one because South Pass, another women's history that was actually national history or historical event that took place up there is South Pass is the first place that a woman held a political office in the United States. Esther Morris became a judge up there. And it was a legislator from South Pass that wrote the laws that gave Wyoming women the rights to vote, the right to hold political office, and to own real estate, which was illegal in many other, all of which were illegal in many other states and territories. So there were some significant events that occurred beyond just the migration of people west, but there were ideas that developed in the South Pass area, maybe because of the long winters and the thin air and people just started raiding. I don't know what the spark was actually, but the fact that all those women started coming west also meant that children began coming west. And when we talk about pioneers, most people still get an image in their mind of John Wayne. We're burning daylight pilgrim, you know, hitch them up, head them up, move them out, and all that kind of stuff. But remember that first big wagon train in 1843 had about 800 to 1,000 people in it, and 500 to maybe 600 of those people in that wagon train were kids. There were lots of children that came west and were pioneers too, and a lot of them were barefoot when they made the journey. And so when we talk about it is our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions, we're also talking about kids. And you know, and then we can get into all kinds of other theories, historical, theoretical foundations about melting pots and pressure cookers and everything else, and how that westward migration shaped American culture, shaped the American identity, and we start seeing images like this come out in the 1860s and 70s with the sun rising in the east on New York, with technology and Christianity and democracy, and bringing the light of Columbia westward into the darkness of the mountains and the stormy skies, and driving the Indians and the wildlife away so that we can have a civilized nation. And that was one of the most popular images in the white part of the United States during the 1800s. This is a little more accurate image, another Jackson painting of what the westward migration actually looked like. And this is titled, he titled this South Pass 1852, the peak migration, 1852, probably 70,000, that's 70, 70,000 people made the trip. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lanes wide, bumper to bumper traffic, as far ahead as you can see, as far behind as you can see, dust in the air, kids are lost, livestock is being driven along loose, chaos on the road. What you're looking at here on the far left horizon is Oregon Buttes. And then you see over on the far right is the Wind River Mountains rising up and the Sweetwater River trickling out of there. It's paradise. Well, okay, it's bleak. But it still looks pretty much the same today as it looked back then. And there are some of us who think that this actually is paradise. And I put this photo in here because one of the treasures that we have in this nation is that several hundred miles of the trail across Wyoming, both on public land and private lands, are still pristine. And they're still, the landscape still looks like it did when the pioneers went across there. In fact, the landscape still looks like it did 13,000 years ago when the first Clovis hunters came through chasing mammoth and bison antiquus. And in the middle of that South Pass landscape is the 9th crossing, the last crossing of Sweetwater. And at first there wasn't anything there. It was just a ford through the river where we brought our wagons through. But then in the late 1850s, South Pass Station was built as a trading post, as a post for, first called Markham's Fort, or the Mormon Mail Station, as a way station for travelers on the trail. It was a Pony Express and telegraph station. It was used for many multiple purposes. We call it Burnt Ranch today because it got torched repeatedly. First in 1857 during the so-called Mormon War, and then the Sioux burned it in 1866, and then the Sioux burned it again in 1868, right after this woman and her family had purchased what was left of the site and a new toll bridge and tried to make a living there, and were driven out and spent the rest of their lives in South Pass City. So this is what Burnt Ranch looks like today. Private property owned by my friends, the Hellier family, and who are in the process of nominating this as a National Historic Landmark. It's important that these precious places that are significant to national history be preserved. And this is one of them that made the growth of the nation possible to become a continental nation and a global power. It doesn't look like much today, but when we're out there, and I've got people in the wagons and things camping there, they really can feel the magic. It's something that's real and potent in that landscape, and especially at this site. And it's interesting because some years ago I had friends on the Shoshone Reservation, which is just 10 miles away from where I live, and Pine Ridge up in South Dakota. Both independently told me stories about a great battle that had taken place at Burnt Ranch. And I thought, you know, like most graduate students, that, well, I know everything, and I've never heard of this before, so it can't be that important. But they kept telling me more stories about this, and both from the Shoshone perspective and the Lakota perspective. And what the story comes down to had an impact on, it was not just a battle between two Indian nations. It was a battle that affected the development of the United States as well. And in the spring of 1861, Washakie and the Eastern Shoshones, pictured here a couple miles away, were camped at Burnt Ranch because part of a primary portion of their income was derived from trading with the wagon trains and the people at the trading post there at Burnt Ranch. Come in and trade their buffalo hides for weapons or pots and pans or beads or whatever. And it's important to remember that when Fremont first visited this area back in the 1840s, you can see along the bottom there on his map, he labeled this the war ground of the Snake and Sioux Indians. Snakes was an old term for Shoshones. And in 1861, it was still a war ground. One morning, it was as described by the traders who wrote this down and sent letters to the Salt Lake newspapers. A 200 mounted Sioux warriors with the sun glistening off of their lances rode down through the Shoshone village, and the short version is they captured every single Shoshone horse. And that left Washakie with a problem, because it's hard to be a nomadic hunter-gatherer, a Plains Indian, when you don't have any horses left, when the Sioux have captured all 1,000 of your horses in your band. And so he ended up having to take his people and retreat back to Salt Lake City for a couple of years and beg for food from Brigham Young, who he didn't like. He didn't like the Mormons, and he really didn't like Brigham Young, but he had to depend on them for sustenance for a couple of years until he could recoup his horse herd. And this was a transformative event for the Shoshones, because they no longer were the dominant force in the South Pass area. The United States government had depended on them as relatively friendly towards the government and the army, so that the covered wagons and the military and the explorers and everybody else could get through that country and get on out west to California, Oregon, or Washington. And I tell my students, one of the reasons, one year I was voted both the best professor on campus and the meanest professor on campus. Okay, I'm already having mental problems. This doesn't make it any easier. But I make my students, the majors, do a lot of public presentations and conference presentations and things. And when they're standing up in front of a room like that, I had one girl come back and sit down next to me after she was done, and she said, "My boots are all full of sweat." These kids are terrified. I'm terrified. I was living in a tent all summer long, and I just finished a slideshow like this morning about an hour ago, and now here I'm trying to sound coherent and professional, and it's not working very well. But I tell my students, I don't want to hear just an inventory of data. Don't just tell me a bunch of stuff that happened. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Tell me why I should care. Tell me why anybody should care enough that we want to talk about it or hear about something that happened 100 or 1,000 years ago. Tell me why it's important. And that's what scares them, because it's easy just to rattle off data. But the reason this Indian battle was important both to the tribes, because it changed the balance of power between them. Washakie became helpless. The Sioux became the dominant alliance on the plains as far west as the Continental Divide, and more powerful even than the United States out in the west at that time. And Lincoln had been depending on the Shoshone presence to help keep the trail open and passable to our immigration. And just about a month or 6 weeks earlier, the Confederates had fired on Fort Sumter and the Civil War began. And now suddenly, Lincoln has a dilemma, because he needs to keep South Pass open so that the California gold can keep coming back east, whether it's by ship or wagon or stagecoach or anything. And he needs to maintain overland communication with the Californians, where there is a very strong secessionist movement, and also with Oregon and Washington, where there's a strong secessionist movement. He can't afford to lose the whole West Coast along with all the southern states. So Lincoln has a predicament now, is how do I get the Sioux out of there and get South Pass back open and the telegraph up and running again, so that we can fight the war, prosecute the war. And he makes a deal with Brigham Young, who sends the Mormon militia out to reopen some of the stations, and then slowly Lincoln manages to send volunteer cavalry from Ohio and Nebraska and Kansas out west to make official military U.S. Army garrisons of these places. And the whole site now is protected, this place of national significance that impacted the rest of the planet is protected by these folks and by the Hellier family. And they are aware of what they have, and they're very protective of it, and I am grateful to them for that. Like I say, they're in the process now of starting a National Historic Landmark nomination for private property, and most people won't do that. But they're not sitting on any kind of ordinary property. And back during the 1860s, from my own perspective, my family settled in the 1850s in Minnesota. By the 1870s, they were out onto the plains in Dakota and Nebraska and serving in the Frontier Army. And you know, when you want to talk about your yearly multiplying millions, we contributed. We bred like rats. My mother started counting first and second cousins and quit at 250 in disgust. The little girl at the farthest right in the front row there is my grandmother. Standing next to her, grandmother, my great-grandmother, that's my great-grandpa in the middle of the back row, and they settled the West. And I grew up with their stories of blizzards, of cattle drives, of railroads, of trails, of wagons, and going places, and being scared, and being hungry and cold, and everything else. My grandpa said, "There's no such thing as the good old days. Why don't you go get a real job?" Grandpa, I'm getting paid, but he felt, you know, as a Nebraska cattleman, if you're not land break or raising cows, then it's not worth doing. So now I do that too, in addition to everything else. But as Tom said, I had the good fortune to get a couple of degrees from UW and a lot of field experience, starting with Oregon Trail sites, including the Bordeaux Trading Post here down by Fort Laramie. And since then, I've taught field schools here at Pacific Springs. Here's a Seminole Cutoff cemetery, Pioneer Cemetery, that we're working on here. And what I want to emphasize again is how important OCTA's work is in terms of preservation. Preservation of historic sites along the trail, preservation of trail ruts, preservation of the landscape, the view shed on both sides of the trail. Sarah Thomas here died in 1854 and was buried beside the Seminole Cutoff just a short distance east of Burt Ranch, just a short distance east of South Pass. She's been dug up 2 or 3 times that I know of, and then reburied, which is what's going on in this photo here. She's being reburied by some friends of mine back in 1969. Well, I was just a little kid, but they were grown-ups by then. But it's preserving this trail is important, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a bit, because the trail ruts, the pristine landscape, are literally a time machine. And you know, we think Jules Verne, the time machine, and it's all science fiction, hocus pocus, and not really worth reading. But the trail is. And the experience that I had and the education that I got me a job here. This is South Pass City in the fall of 1870, 300 buildings, maybe 1,000 people on a busy weekend. And I was appointed curator up there for several years. And it was an important place, again, because this woman on the right, Esther Morris, was the first woman in the nation to hold a political office. She was a judge in South Pass City, and she was able to do that, to make that great leap for mankind, because the guy on the left, Colonel Bright, Captain Bright from Virginia, a Civil War, Union War veteran, got a law passed through the Wyoming legislature in the territorial constitution that women can run for office, can vote, and can own real estate. And again, I repeat, that was unique in America, in the United States at that time. So once again, there's a historical event that affects all Americans today that happened at South Pass. When I got there, there were only about 30 buildings left. This is a photo from about 1906 that shows the main part of the business district that still exists today. The house I lived in is the little one on the far right with the white front, the white gable end there. It was an interesting time to live in a site with 30 original buildings, 30,000 original artifacts on exhibit in those buildings. It's not some curator's idea of what the Old West might have looked like. It's the real McCoy. And out of some 20,000 photographs at the site in the archives, we know which rooms and which buildings a lot of those artifacts were used in because we have photos of them. And so it's been an extraordinary place. As Tom said, winter does happen there though. And sometimes it looks, that's our house in the winter. And my wife wasn't real happy all the time because she was stuck in there with 2 little kids. And I would get interesting phone calls, and like we were sitting in there one day waiting for the snow to melt, and I got a call from a fellow who said he's with the National Geographic, and that they were kind of frustrated because they had this cool idea. They wanted to bring a whole bunch of teachers from the East Coast out to go on covered wagon rides, and so that they so that they could take that knowledge and that experience back to their classrooms and teach the youth of tomorrow. You know, and if you look around this room, almost all of us in here are pushing 100 years old. So we need to do some recruiting like this. And I thought, hey, cool, this is a great idea. And he said, the problem we have is that like all the historians that we talk to don't have any practical skills at all. And that was sort of insulting. And then he said, and all the cowboys that we talked to are just a bunch of drunks. And that was insulting too. So we did get off to a real good start. But he said, do you know anybody that could do something like that? And I said, well, we could probably cobble something together. I'd get some teams and horses and teamsters and everything. And so what that led to was 17 years of outfitting on the Oregon Trail with covered wagons, and these were college credit trips. They weren't just for fun. We made people suffer for college credit. And if they weren't miserable, I had not done my job. And we usually did our job. And this was important again because I can only get into so many classrooms during the course of the year. But if I talk to several hundred teachers in the course of the year, and they all teach for 10 or 20 more years, and they have 20 or 25 kids in their classrooms, suddenly I'm talking directly to thousands upon thousands upon thousands of little kids and high school kids and college students all over the country. In fact, that first trip that we did for National Geographic, we had 55 people from all over the US and from Germany participated in that. It was a huge group, and it was so much fun that we just kept doing it. But again, we can only get so many classes out on the trail. I can only go talk to so many classes, and this became a pretty efficient way to recruit for the Oregon-California Trail Association. But we need to keep working on that. For my kids, it meant that they grew up on the trail. My son started driving a team when he was 4.5, 5 years old, and along with this old rancher that lived up there. And they thought that this covered wagon life was perfectly normal. They just assumed everybody lived this way. And I also have to say that my daughter there never took a breath for the first 12 months of her life. All she did was scream and holler and cry because she was real colicky. And so we always were kind of a little bit frazzled in the summer when Danny Walker and the State Archaeologist crew would show up from Laramie, and Danny would say, "Give me that kid." And we'd say, "Okay." And as soon as she got in his arms, she would quit crying and go to sleep. And I don't know what it is about Danny Walker, because he never put me to sleep, but he sure did her. And so the kids just grew up on the trail, and you know, they grew up horseback and driving wagons and teams and everything else. And that landscape affected them so much, especially my son, that when he got out of college and went into the 82nd Airborne, he said, "If anything happens to me, I want my remains cremated and scattered up there at Burnt Ranch in South Pass." And again, this is such a magical, moving place. And part of it is that we moved. And so we would take people out for college credit, either usually through the National Geographic or the U.S. Department of Education, and we'd make them hike. They all thought they wanted to start out riding the wagons, but those things are so uncomfortable and so rough with no suspension that most of them ended up walking or riding the saddle horses, and they suffered. And so we moved day after day after day, minimum of 5 days. We wouldn't go any shorter than that because they hadn't suffered enough to really understand. Oh, you think it's funny? They hadn't suffered enough to really understand the experience. And 10 days was better because by then they were really ready to die. We often stopped, not so that they could have a break, but to talk about things that happened, to talk about events of local, regional, or national significance and give the teams a break, just like the pioneers did back in the 1840s. And sometimes we'd stop like here and we'd feed them. And they like to eat because they're not used to being outside. Some of these people had never been camping before, never been on a horse before, and so it was kind of unnerving and frightening for them, but we took good care of them and did things like take the wheels off the wagons. And because we had to talk about 19th century mechanical technologies too, how did people go west and what were the problems that happened? And take this back to your classroom and see how they like it. And then we talked about women's issues. How did you be a woman and remain healthy, especially if you're pregnant or during childbirth, on the trail? And what kind of clothes did you have to wear? And it was really a learning experience, and these people spent a lot of time actually in a college classroom with no heat and no air conditioning. And here we've got another speaker. We brought lots of people on that doubled as wranglers or teamsters that were also lecturers, college lecturers, and this guy's talking about how did the early explorers make their maps? How did they do their paintings? How did they record the landscape to go back to Congress and show what was out west here? And sometimes we let them have recess, And what they're doing here is they caught a bunch, this is Pacific Springs, the old stage station, and they caught a bunch of horny toads and they were having horny toad races. So that's your teachers, public educators, on their free time. Only twice in all those years did we have somebody see the elephant, to use that old pioneer expression. And the first one was one morning a former Miss Wisconsin, you know, the beauty pageant of former Miss Wisconsin, got up and came to breakfast and said, "I don't get it. What's the point of all this anyway?" And she made us take her home. Well, we didn't take her, we sent her to the airport. And then one day, this is a beautiful landscape. I love it. We're driving along here and we stop for lunch and people crawl under the wagons to get a little bit of shade. And this great big guy's like 6'6" and he'd spent $1,000 on Stetsons and boots and belts and jeans and everything else before he came out on the trail with us. And he started sweating like Niagara Falls and his hands were shaking and he jumped up and dumped his food all over the ground and said, "How do you people know where you're going? There aren't any signs out here. We could get lost and we could all die." And he just totally saw the elephant. We had to pull one of my camp crews off in a whole truck and trailer and take him down to the airport in Riverton and put him on a plane back to Chicago. I try to schedule whenever I drive through Chicago. I want to do that at 2 in the morning because it scares the living Jesus out of me. But he was scared safe for us. And so we just keep rolling and trying to share the meaning of the trail with these people so that they can take it back to their classrooms. And the power of the landscape made that so easy to do. And this is part of what makes what Helliers are doing with their National Historic Landmark nomination so important, because that might encourage other private landowners to make protections on their land that will help protect this whole area. The BLM has done a wonderful job of working with the National Park Service, the Trails Office, trying to do preservation management decisions in this area, but it's the places along the river, the private property, that are concerning to us now, because these sites, these campsites, these trading post sites, the trail ruts themselves are what built this nation. They are as important as the Yorktown Battlefield or Independence Hall in Philadelphia as anything else. And that brings us to Gettysburg, of all places. Here we see the Confederates charging up the ridge, trying to break the nation asunder. And Gettysburg is often credited as being the turning point of the Civil War, where the nation was preserved intact with a north and a south. But South Pass is what gave the nation the West. It fulfilled the same role as the Gettysburg battlefield. And Burnt Ranch was part of that. And we need to consider, I had a professor once who said nothing important ever happened out west. All the important events in American history happened on the East Coast. And I beg to differ, because South Pass is the place that gave the nation its continental proportions, the wealth and power that we needed to become a dominant force on the planet. And so this first and last picture that I'm going to show you of this campsite, which is also on Hellier's Burnt Ranch property, is one of my favorite places in the world, because you're sitting up there looking out north across the Sweetwater Valley. You can't see the river here because it's just tucked away down in one of those little draws. But the guy on the right was one of the lecturers that used to come out on these trips with us, and he looks like a Yale professor because in fact that's what he is. And he used to go down and advise the White House and the Defense Department in Washington, D.C. a couple times a month and tell them what was going on in Asia. And he's an expert on economics, on nuclear politics, and other political aspects of the entire Pacific Rim and the Asian nations, Paul Bracken. But he's also a guy who can saddle his own horse and knows how to ride. And so he and I were standing in this camp, downhill, with all these teachers, 30, 40 teachers seated in a semicircle around us, just like kindergarten crisscross applesauce people. And we're talking about all of this and the impacts that the trail had on American development. How by the early 1850s, we had pretty much consolidated our grip on the West Coast, on California, Oregon, Washington. We're we're still at risk of going to war with Great Britain, the most powerful nation in the world, over our Canadian border, but we had the West Coast. And that's what Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark out to do, but it actually took a couple women, teenage women, one of whom was pregnant, to actually realize that dream so that other people could get out west and follow their footsteps, follow their skirts. And so by the early 1850s, we were sending American warships into Tokyo Bay, threatening to level the city of Tokyo if they didn't open up their commerce and trade with the United States. And we were involved in opening and colonizing other nations all around the Pacific. And Paul Bracken was talking about this, and why have we fought 5 major wars in the Pacific in the last 150 years or so. And while we're doing this, in that beautiful landscape, and people are looking out over all of God's creation, this one guy started crying, and one of the teachers in the audience started crying. And so we kind of shut down and, well, what's going on here? And he said, I was 19 years old when they sent me to Vietnam. And I was walking along, and my friend took a round right through the head, and I had his brains and blood all over my face. And I never knew what we were doing there. I never understood it. And I come out here to learn about goddamn covered wagons and dirt, and all of a sudden the whole world starts to make sense to me. And that's the kind of power that this kind of landscape and the trail can have on people. It helps them understand how this dirty, dusty old Oregon Trail history is relevant to them today. Why should we talk about something that happened 150 or 200 years ago? Because it shaped our lives today. And that guy didn't understand it until he was out in that campsite. And what the work that OCTA does is really important. It's fun and it's exciting. And I'm told by my wife, who may or may not be lying, that I once sat bolt upright in bed and said, boy, that history sure is neat stuff. And the clunk just went right back down again. You know, history's pretty cool, yeah. But it's important. And a lot of people, my grandfather was one of them. Why don't you go get a real job, Toddy? You know, history is important because it determines, present tense, what we are today and the lives we live. Why are we sailing American warships through the Taiwan Straits between Taiwan and China right now? Because of those covered wagons. Everything that happens in the Pacific immediately affects us. And that's only because all of those courageous pioneers went all the way west, and just like 40 or 50,000 of them died at Gettysburg, some 50,000 people died along the trail too. And that doesn't count all the Native Americans that died trying to protect their homelands. But so while we're working on trail preservation, have fun, because that history sure is neat stuff. But realize that we're doing something, we're taking what our ancestors left us, gave us, and trying to do something with those resources today to pass them on to our descendants. And if I go any farther, I'll start repeating myself, so I should just stop right now.